The smell of proofing dough still gets me every time. Yeast and sugar and warm flour, a smell I built a company on, a smell I raised a boy on. I was standing in the walk-in cooler of my own flagship bakery, holding a crate of the original sourdough starter jars, the ones from 1994, the ones I planned to raise at my own retirement gala in about 6 minutes, when I heard my nephew and Appo's fiancée laugh. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh people do when they think no one and Appo's listening. End quote. She still writes checks by hand, end quote, Priya said. End quote. She trusts anyone who smiles at her. This is going to be easier than we thought. End quote. I didn't an Appo's move. I and Appo's. We spent 40 years learning how to read a room before the room knows I and Appo's am in it, and every instinct in my body told me to stay exactly where I was, behind a rack of butter in the cold, listening to my family plan something. End quote. The wording has to sound like love, end quote, said a voice I didn't and Appo's recognize. Older. Precise. Careful in a way that told me she and Appo's said this kind of sentence before more than once to more than one family. End quote. Wellness leave. Not incapacity. Not yet. We introduce incapacity later, once the board and Appo's already comfortable with the idea that something in Appo's wrong. You Don and Appo's hand people the conclusion. You let them arrive at it themselves, end quote. Then Miles and Appo's voice. My Miles. The boy I raised after a highway accident took both his parents when he was 9, the boy I taught to laminate dough at 11 because grief needed somewhere to go and I gave him butter and flour instead of therapy because that and Appo's what I knew how to give. End quote. She and Appo's believe it, end quote, he said. End quote. She trusts me. End quote. There was a pause after that. A short one. I and Appo's replayed it 100 times since, trying to decide if it was guilt or satisfaction, and I still can and Appo's tell you which. End quote. Good, end quote, Denise said. End quote. Because we only get to run this once. If she smells it coming, we lose the clause and we lose the timeline, and Meridian doesn't and Appo's wait around for family drama. End quote. I want to tell you my heart broke right there in that cooler. It didn't and Appo's not yet. Something colder happened first. Something that had been quietly accumulating for months. A missed birthday call, a contract I wasn't and Appo's shown until it was already signed, a look Miles gave me at a supplier meeting like he was already measuring the room for someone else and Appo's furniture. All of it clicked into a single sickening shape, the way a recipe you and Appo's made blind for years suddenly reveals itself as something you never actually understood. I set the crate of starter jars down on a shelf quietly so the glass wouldn't and Appo's clink, and I walked back out into the noise of my own party. 300 people. String lights strung between the exposed beams of the commissary kitchen, because I and Appo's insisted the gala be held there instead of some rented ballroom. I wanted people standing where the actual work happened. A jazz trio in the corner. My general managers from 6 states flown in on the company and Appo's dime, laughing with servers who and Appo's worked for me since they were teenagers. My whole life essentially arranged under one roof to say goodbye to the version of me that used to run it alone. I put on the warmest smile I own. I found Miles by the dessert table, and I let him hug me, and I let myself feel for one more minute like none of it was true. Then I stepped up to the small stage we and Appo's built out of 2 pallets and a rug, raised a jar of sourdough starter I and Appo's kept alive since before Miles could walk, and gave a toast to 30 years of Vasquez and Amp, daughters. I told 300 people how proud I was of my family. I meant every word about the company. I meant almost none of it by then about the 2 people standing closest to me on that stage. Nobody in that room knew I and Appo's just decided to destroy them. But I didn't and Appo's know yet how deep it went, who else was involved, or what, end quote. Easier than we thought, end quote, actually meant. I only knew 3 things. Somebody had a plan, somebody had already started it, and I was going to need a lot more information before I let any of them see me flinch. I didn't and Appo's sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen at home, not the commissary, my actual kitchen, the small one with the yellow tile I and Appo's never updated, and I made a list on the back of a receipt the way I and Appo's made every important decision of my life. Not a list of accusations. A list of questions. Who else knew? How long it had been planned? What the clause meant because I and Oppos written more than one clause into those bylaws over the years and I needed to know which knife they intended to use. By 7 the next morning I was in my accountant and Oppos' office with the door locked. Waltose had done my books for 26 years. He and Oppos been in the room the day I signed the lease on the very first storefront, back when I was still cleaning restaurant kitchens at 4 in the morning to cover the deposit, and he was the only person alive who knew both my company and Oppos' numbers and my actual feelings about them, which is a more intimate relationship than most marriages manage. I told him what I and Oppos heard word for word, while he sat very still with his coffee going cold in front of him. Eleanor. He said my name the way he says it when he and Oppos' about to disagree with me. I need you to understand something. If I go looking and I find nothing, we go back to pretending this never happened, and you go on believing your family had a bad night and said something they didn't and Oppos' mean. But if I find something, then we Don and Oppos' pretend anything I said. Pull every vendor contract Miles has personally approved in the last 18 months. Everyone. Start there. You could call a lawyer today he said. Right now. This morning. I could I agreed. And the second I do this becomes a war with lawyers on both sides, and wars like that get settled quietly behind closed doors by people who and Oppos' never once stood in that kitchen. I Don and Oppos' want quiet. I want it to be impossible to hide He didn't and Oppos' like that answer. Walt has never liked my instincts as much as he and Oppos' respected them, which is probably why we and Oppos' worked together so long. Took him 4 days. He came back into my office grim, a folder in his hands like it was something dead he was carrying by the tail. There and Oppos' a firm he said. Larkspur Collective. Brand Consulting. According to the invoices, Miles has authorized over $400,000 in payments to them since March. I and Oppos' gone through every line item twice. There and Oppos' no deliverable. No brand deck. No market study. No presentation anyone in this company has ever seen. For $100,000 and I can and Oppos' find a single piece of paper it bought us. For $100,000 is not a number you misplace by accident. That and Oppos' not neglect, not a young executive getting sloppy with a budget. That and Oppos' a decision made by someone who assumed nobody would ever check, made by someone who and Oppos' watched me hand over the checkbook and the trust that came with it and decided both were free to spend. Find out who owns it I said. It took him another 6 days, which felt like 60. He called me at 9 at night, and I could hear in his voice before he even said the name that it was bad. Larkspur Collective was incorporated 4 months ago, he said. Registered agent is a man named Andre Okafor, I actually laughed. A short, ugly sound because it was so much worse than I and Oppos' let myself imagine, and because some old stubborn part of me still hadn't and Oppos' wanted to believe Priya and Oppos' mother was standing at the center of it. Denise Okafor and Oppos' brother. Denise, the woman I and Oppos' met exactly 3 times, always thought was sharp, always thought was the kind of person you and Oppos' want negotiating on your behalf rather than against you. I and Oppos' been wrong about which side of the table she belonged on. A shell company, run by my future in-law and Oppos' brother. Funded with my company and Oppos' money. Approved by my nephew and Oppos' signature on a line where his handwriting used to look like a child and Oppos' back when I first taught him to sign invoices at 16, standing beside me at this exact desk. I sat with that for a long night before I called Walt back and asked him to bring in someone we and Oppos' never needed before, someone who could follow money the way Walt followed recipes. Exactly, precisely, without a shred of sentiment attached to the outcome. Renata Cruz arrived the following week with a laptop bag, a legal pad, and no apparent interest in small talk, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. She spent 3 days going through Larkspur and Oppos' S invoices line by line before she finally looked up at me across my own kitchen table. Flour still, somebody and Oppos. S funding legal review on a transaction, and hiding the cost inside your operating budget so it never has to be explained to your board. End quote. End quote. Due diligence for what? End quote. End quote. That end quote, she said. End quote. I don't and Oppos, Tino yet. But whoever and Oppos, S buying or selling, has already spent real money making sure the paperwork will survive a challenge later. This ISN and Oppos, T improvised. Somebody planned for scrutiny, end quote. That was the moment the ground genuinely shifted under me. This wasn't an Oppos, T Miles panicking doing something reckless because he felt entitled to more than I and Oppos, D given him. This was engineered, funded, lawyered months in advance. Someone had been building toward this for longer than I wanted to think about, and I had spent that same stretch of time proudly watching my nephew run board meetings, believing I was witnessing him grow into the company. I and Oppos, D been watching him take it apart the entire time. I told Walt I wanted eyes on the board correspondence next, and that and Oppos, S where the second gut punch landed. Miles had been quietly reaching out to 3 board members, the newest ones, the ones with the least history with me, the ones who and Oppos, D never sat across a table from me during the years I built this thing with my own hands, about and quote, streamlining and quote, quorum requirements, framed as modernization, framed as efficiency, the kind of language that sounds reasonable in an email and only turns sinister once you understand what it and Oppos S actually for. What it quietly did, buried 3 clauses deep in a proposed bylaw revision, was lower the number of votes needed to ratify any major board decision, including, though it wasn't an Oppos, T named outright anywhere in the document, a vote on founder capacity. I wrote that capacity clause myself 20 years ago at 3 a.m. after watching a friend and Oppos S company get run into the ground by a founder who wouldn't and Oppos T step aside even after 2 strokes left her unable to recognize her own accountant. I remember writing it at this same kitchen table, thinking I was being responsible, thinking I was protecting the company from a version of myself that might not know when to let go. I never once imagined I and Oppos D be the one it got used against by the boy I raised, while I was standing in a kitchen with both hands perfectly steady and my mind sharper than it had been in years. I made Walt read me the exact language of the clause out loud twice even though I and Oppos D written it myself and knew it better than almost any other document I owned. I wanted to hear it the way a stranger would hear it, the way a board member with no history with me would hear it, cold on a page, with no memory of the woman who wrote it standing there to explain her intentions. Read that way it was frighteningly simple. A majority vote once quorum is met, based on a physician and Oppos S evaluation submitted by any 2 officers acting in good faith. I and Oppos D written in quote, good faith in quote, assuming good faith was something you could count on from people who loved you. That assumption, more than any single clause, was the actual mistake sitting at the center of all of this. End quote, you could amend it, end quote, Walt said. End quote, right now before any vote is called. Close the loophole before Miles gets the chance to use it. End quote. I thought about that for a long moment, turning a pen over in my hand. End quote. If I amend it now out of nowhere 3 weeks before my own retirement transition, it looks exactly like what they want the board to already believe. A founder acting erratically, making sudden changes to her own governance under stress. I and Oppos D be handing them the evidence themselves, end quote. I set the pen down. End quote, no. If this is going to end, it has to end because of what they did, not because I panicked and rewrote my own bylaws in the dark. End quote. Walt didn't and Oppos T love that answer either. But he didn't and Oppos T argue with it, which from Walt is its own kind of agreement. Renata found the calendar invites next, deleted but not deleted the way you and Oppos D1 if you actually understood how deletion works. 6 meetings over 2 months. Miles, Priya, Denise, and a 4th name that appeared only as in quote, M group end quote, attached to a location downtown I didn't and Oppos T recognize, a private dining room in a hotel I and Oppos D never had reason to visit. End quote. Meridian Group end quote. Renata said, after 2 more days of digging through public filings and old news archives. End quote. National Food Conglomerate. They and Oppos V bought and shuttered 11 regional bakery and catering chains in the last 6 years. Same pattern every time. Keep the recipes, license the brand name onto shelf products sold in grocery chains, close every physical location within 18 months, lay off everyone who ISN and oppos. T corporate. End quote. I had to sit down. Not because I was afraid for myself. Because I finally completely understood what this actually was. It was never about taking the company away from me. It was about erasing it. Every commissary kitchen I and oppos. D fought a landlord to secure. Every recipe I and oppos. D written on index cards before Miles was born. 340 people who owned a piece of what they and oppos. D built alongside me because I and oppos. D structured it that way on purpose because I never wanted anyone working for me to feel like they were working for someone else and oppos. S dream instead of their own. End quote. There and oppos. S a term sheet and quote. Renata said 2 weeks later, sliding a printout across the table. End quote. Draft only but detailed. $22 million, full asset acquisition. Contingent. End quote. She tapped one line already underlined in red ink. End quote. Contingent on the employee stock ownership plan being dissolved before closing. End quote. Dissolved. Not honored. Not bought out fairly. Dissolved so the 340 people who and oppos. D earned their stake in this company across years, some of them decades, would receive nothing, while Miles, Priya, and Denise split whatever was left once the conglomerate and oppos. S money hit an account none of my employees would ever be shown. And then Renata found the last piece, the one that told me this had never been an impulsive betrayal, that it had been calculated from the very beginning. Miles had quietly begun transferring his personal company shares into a new holding LLC 3 months before the gala. Before the cooler conversation. Before I and oppos. D ever heard Denise and oppos. S careful rehearsed voice discussing wording. He hadn't and oppos. T been talked into this by Denise somewhere along the way. He and oppos. D been ready before any of us ever sat down to celebrate 30 years of the company we supposedly built together. Renata wasn't and oppos. T finished though. A week after the share transfer discovery, she came to me with something she said she and oppos. D almost dismissed as irrelevant, a loose thread that turned out to be the ugliest one yet. End quote. I ran Denise and oppos. S name against public court filings out of habit, end quote, she said. End quote. Not because I expected anything. I always check backgrounds fully once I and oppos. Am this deep into someone. End quote. She slid 2 more folders across the table, thinner than the others, older. End quote. 6 years ago, a family-owned catering supply company in another state. A founder capacity dispute. Denise was listed as a financial consultant to the buyer. 2 years before that, a regional furniture manufacturer, same pattern, different consulting name on the letterhead. End quote. I read both folders twice before I could speak. End quote. She and oppos. S done this before, end quote, I said, and it came out quieter than I intended. End quote. At least twice that I can find with a week of searching, end quote, Renata said. End quote. I and oppos. D bet money there and oppos. S a third we haven and oppos. T located yet. Same architecture every time. Identify a founder succession clause. Attach herself to a family member with access. Wait for an opening. End quote. That changed something in me, hearing it laid out like that. This had never been a family falling apart over money, however painful that alone would have been. This was a professional operation, run by someone who had done this to strangers before, who had simply found her way this time into my family through my nephew and oppos. S engagement, patient as anything, waiting years if that and oppos. S what it took. I won and oppos. T pretend that discovery didn't and oppos. T cost me something. I sat alone in my kitchen that night with a cracked mixing bowl I and oppos. V never once considered throwing away. The one from my very first storefront, the one that split during a snowstorm my second winter in business and that I patched with epoxy because I couldn't and oppos. T afford a new one and never replaced once I could, running my thumb along the chip in its rim the way I have for 30 years whenever I need to actually think instead of just react. I let myself grieve for about an hour. Just an hour. I gave myself that much, sitting in the dark with a bowl older than my nephew and oppos. S memory of his own parents, and then I went back to work because grief wasn't and oppos. T going to save 340 jobs, and there was no one else coming to do this for me. I couldn't oppose. T stopped the incapacity vote once it was formally called. My lawyers were unambiguous about that. Under my own bylaws, the ones I oppose, D written to protect the company, once a founder capacity motion is properly raised by an officer, it proceeds to the board regardless of the founder oppose's personal objection. Fighting it head-on, publicly, immediately would only start a legal war that could bleed the company dry in litigation costs before any of it was ever resolved. A war Miles and Denise had clearly built room for in their planning. A war I suspect they were counting on, because a company distracted by lawsuits is a company too exhausted to notice what else is happening underneath it. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted, right up until the moment I didn't oppose. I let myself get a little foggy in meetings. I repeated a question I oppose, D already asked twice, watching Miles oppose S face carefully while I did it. I forgot a supplier oppose S name I oppose, V known for 15 years on purpose in front of him in front of 2 board members who oppose, D only known me a year and had no memory to measure the forgetting against, and I watched something in Miles oppose S shoulders relax like he oppose, D been holding his breath for weeks and could finally let it go. He got careless almost immediately after that. That oppose S the thing about people who oppose, V convince themselves they oppose, re smarter than the person they oppose, re deceiving the moment they believe the deception is working they stop double checking their own work. Miles stopped copying certain emails to legal review he used to copy religiously. He started leaving printouts of things on his desk overnight instead of locking them away. He got sloppy the way a man gets sloppy when he thinks the hardest part is already behind him. There was one afternoon about a week into my staged fog, when he sat across from me in my office and asked gently, almost kindly, whether I oppose, D been sleeping all right. I told him I oppose, D been a little tired, that I oppose, D forgotten to lock the delivery gate the night before, a lie I oppose, D planted deliberately, knowing the overnight guard would mention it to him. He reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. End quote, you oppose, Veern some rest, Aunt Elle, end quote, he said. End quote. Nobody would blame you for slowing down. End quote. I let him hold my hand for exactly as long as it took to memorize the particular warmth of his own performance, and then I told him I was going to lie down for a bit, and I went home and called Renata instead. While Miles relaxed, I called Sam Whitfield. I oppose, D mentored Sam 20 years ago, back when he was a supply broker nobody in this industry took seriously, back when he oppose. D shown up to a trade conference in a suit that didn't oppose. T fit and I oppose. D spent an hour teaching him how to read a contract instead of laughing at him like everyone else in the room. I oppose. D never asked him for anything in return, not once in 2 decades of watching him build a quiet, respectable business of his own. I asked him now. End quote. I need real numbers, end quote. I told him over the phone. End quote. Independent. Provable. What chains our size, our revenue, our footprint, have actually sold for when a company like Meridian buys them. Not what they claim to offer. What they oppose. V actually paid historically when someone forces them to. End quote. It took him 3 weeks and half his old contact list, calling in favors from brokers who owed him more than they oppose. D admit, but he came back with numbers that made Renata whistle out loud, an actual sound of surprise, the first I oppose. D heard from her in a month of working together. Meridian oppose. S offer wasn't oppose, T generous. It was a lowball, dressed up in confident language to look like a favor, banking entirely on the assumption that nobody inside my company would have the outside data to prove otherwise. Miles never checked because Miles assumed I was the only person left alive who understood this business well enough to question a number like that. He oppose. D built his entire plan on the belief that once I was gone or discredited, nobody left standing would know enough to argue. He assumed wrong and it wasn't oppose. T even close. There was one close call during those weeks, one moment that nearly ended everything before it began. Renata tried to pull deeper into Miles oppose. S device records to confirm the exact date of the LLC share transfer, and something on his end pinged, a security alert, some small digital tripwire neither of us had accounted for, a moment where he clearly sensed someone was looking at something they shouldn't oppose. TB. He didn't oppose. T know it was us. But he panicked enough to move the wellness leave vote up by 2 weeks. collapsing what had been a comfortable timeline into something closer to a sprint. We finished the evidence file in 11 days instead of the 30 we and Oppos D planned for. Walt didn't and Oppos T sleep more than 4 hours a night that entire stretch. Neither did I. There were mornings I stood at my own kitchen counter at 5 a.m., coffee going cold beside a folder of Shell Company documents, and thought about how strange it was that I and Oppos D spent my whole life building something out of flour and patience, and now I was fighting to keep it with spreadsheets and stolen calendar invites. 3 days before the vote, Priya showed up at my house alone at 9 at night, and stood on my porch not saying anything for almost a full minute. I could see her breath in the porch light. I could see she and Oppos D been crying or trying very hard not to. End quote. I Don and Oppos T agree with all of it, end quote, she finally said. End quote. I never wanted the wellness leave thing to be real. I told my mother that more than once. She said I didn't and Oppos T understand how these things work. End quote. I could have told her everything right then. Part of me, a tired, aching part, genuinely wanted to. But I and Oppos D learned enough about Denise and Oppos S precision by then to know that even one wrong word passed to the wrong person could unravel 3 weeks of careful work overnight. And I needed this to land exactly once in front of everyone, with no chance for anyone to quietly clean it up behind closed doors before the board ever saw it. End quote. Go home, Priya, end quote. I said gently, because whatever else was true, I didn't and Oppos T think she deserved cruelty for standing on my porch at 9 at night looking like that. End quote. Get some rest. End quote. She left. I didn't and Oppos T know, watching her taillights disappear down the street, whether I and Oppos D just protected my plan or lost the only person in that circle capable of doing the right thing when it mattered most. The emergency board meeting was called for a Tuesday morning, 9 sharp, in the same boardroom above the flagship kitchen where I and Oppos D once approved the loan that let us open our second location. Miles stood at the head of the table I used to run in a suit I and Oppos D helped him pick out for his college graduation, and he gave a speech about loving me too much to watch me fade, about honoring my legacy by protecting me from myself before I could embarrass the company I and Oppos D built. It was a good speech. I and Oppos LL give him that. He and Oppos D clearly rehearsed it, probably in front of a mirror, probably more than once, and I watched 3 board members nod along like he and Oppos D practiced it on them individually beforehand, which by then I already knew he had. End quote. I and Oppos V spoken with 2 independent physicians, end quote, he said at one point, his voice catching in exactly the right place, end quote. And I want to be clear, this ISN and Oppos T about control. This has never been about control. I love this woman more than anyone in my life. I just can't and Oppos T keep watching her fade and pretend I Don and Oppos T see it. End quote. Denise sat near the back, hands folded, saying nothing, letting her future son-in-law carry the entire performance alone, which I understood later was itself a kind of insurance. If it failed, she wanted as little of her own voice on the record as possible. Just as the vote was about to be formally called, I stood up. End quote. That was a beautiful speech, end quote, I said. My voice didn't and Oppos T shake. I and Oppos D promised myself it would and Oppos T. End quote. You should be proud of it. End quote. Walt distributed the folders before Miles could fully register what I meant by that. Larkspur Collective. The term sheet with Meridian and Oppos S letterhead. The ESOP dissolution clause, underlined in the same red ink Renata had used the day she first showed it to me. The quorum lobbying emails. The personal share transfer, dated months before any of this supposedly began, proof this had never been a decision made in the heat of anything. I watched the color leave Miles and Oppos S face in real time, watched him reach for words that Warren and Oppos T coming to him, watched 30 years of careful charm fail him for the first time in his life in front of the exact room where charm had always worked before. For 1 second, just one, I saw the 9-year-old boy I and Oppos D taught to laminate dough at this same table, flour on his small hands, grief in his eyes he didn't and Oppos T have words for yet, and it hurt exactly as much as I and Oppos D expected it would. Then Priya stood up from the gallery at the back of the room. She walked to the front, past her fiancé, past her own mother, and handed me a signed affidavit. Not just about this deal, about 2 other family businesses Denise had run this exact scheme against years apart, Under different consulting company names, always the same architecture underneath. Identify a founder succession clause, weaponize it quietly, dissolve whatever protected the employees, sell the remains to the highest conglomerate bidder before anyone could stop it. The room went very quiet. Denise didn't an oppose T move. I think looking back, that was the moment she understood she and oppose. D lost before the board had even said a word. I hadn't and oppose. T planned for what happened next and it and oppose. The part one still think about more than the vote itself. Word travels fast through a commissary kitchen, faster than through any boardroom, because the people down there have spent years learning to read tension through a ceiling. By the time the meeting broke, close to 40 employees had quietly gathered in the hallway outside, still in their aprons, flour on some of their forearms, waiting without anyone having called them there. Nobody clapped. Nobody made a scene. Dana, who and oppose, D run our second location for 11 years, just looked at me and nodded once, the way you nod at someone after a long shift when they're in oppose. Nothing left to say that words would improve. A young line cook I barely knew by name reached out and squeezed my arm as I passed. That was the moment it actually landed for me. More than the folders, more than Priya and oppose. Affidavit, more than watching Miles and oppose. Face change. Not the vote. That hallway. Those aprons. Those people who and oppose. D shown up for me without being asked to, the same way I and oppose. D built this company hoping people would. They didn't and oppose. T just reject the incapacity motion. Within the hour, they voted to remove Miles from his position entirely, and referred the full evidence file to the company and oppose. Legal counsel for further action. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. Standing there watching 30 years of quiet, careful preparation finally pay off in front of the people I and oppose. D need to keep the company running. Mostly I just felt tired, the particular bone-deep tiredness that comes after you and oppose. V held your spine perfectly straight for 3 weeks and finally let it drop. Miles is facing a civil suit from the ESOP Trust and a criminal fraud referral that and oppose. Still working its way through review. Denise and oppose. Pattern caught up with her faster than any of us expected once investigators started pulling threads connecting the other two companies she and oppose. D done this too. Her consulting career is effectively finished, and 2 other families I and oppose. V never met have since reached out to me, quietly, grateful someone finally caught her doing it. One of them, a woman who and oppose. D lost her father and oppose. Furniture company to Denise 6 years ago and never fully understood how. Cried on the phone with me for 20 minutes before she could even finish a sentence. I understood every part of that call better than I wish I did. Priya wasn't an oppose. T prosecuted. She cooperated fully, handed over records even Renata hadn't and oppose. T found and she and oppose. Rebuilding a life somewhere quieter now, away from her mother, away from Miles, away from the version of herself that stood in a walk-in cooler and laughed. Miles and I haven and oppose. T spoken since that morning in the boardroom. I don and oppose. T know if we ever will, not fully, not the way we used to when he was small and grief was something I could still fix with butter and flour. But I haven and oppose. T closed that door all the way either. Some things you leave cracked open not because you and oppose, waiting for anything in particular, but because slamming it shut all the way would cost you something you still want to keep even now, even after everything. I transferred a larger ownership stake to the employee trust 3 weeks after the vote. I didn't and oppose. T rename anything. Vasquez and Amp. Daughters is still Vasquez and Amp. Daughters even though I never had children of my own because every person who and oppose. Ever proof dough in one of my kitchens earned that word a long time ago, earned it in a way no bloodline ever automatically does. Yesterday morning I was in the flagship bakery before 6, hands in flour, running a starter that and oppose. Older than my nephew and oppose. Entire life. One of the newer bakers 22 maybe 23, asked me if I ever get tired of doing this myself instead of letting someone else handle it now that I could, now that I and oppose. D earned the right to sit back. I told her the truth. I said some things you don and oppose. T hand off to anyone else. You just keep your hands in them, every single morning, for as long as you and oppose. Reable. She asked me one more question before she went back to her own station, whether I was angry still after everything. I thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. Anger is a strange thing to carry into your 7th decade. I and oppose. V decided I and oppose. I'm not angry, not really, not anymore. I and oppos. Am careful now in a way I wasn't and oppos. T before and I and oppos. V made my peace with that being the cost of what happened rather than something I resent. I check contracts I used to sign on trust. I ask questions I used to consider rude. I and oppos. V earned that caution and I don and oppos. T intend to apologize for it to anyone. What I am mostly is here. Same ovens. Same starter. A few more names added to the ownership rolls. A few names quietly removed. And the same smell of proofing dough that got me every morning for 30 years before any of this happened, and gets me still. Then I went back to the dough because the ovens don and oppos. T care what happened in a boardroom 3 weeks ago. They only care whether you show up, hands ready, before the sun does.